EVO.
There is no shortage of information related to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. No doubt you are already familiar with the infamous evening in April 1865. Lincoln's murder marked the first successful assassination of a United States president. And subsequent assassinations all play out in a similar way. The victim is vulnerable, unaware of the threats that surround him. The president is enjoying an evening at Ford's Theater with his wife and friends. Booth quietly enters the presidential box and fires. He then makes his escape into the night, and while the president lay dying, a massive manhunt is launched. The story is daring, it's exciting, and it's true, but it also can be weighed down by people's attempts at writing history. The goal of this series is to offer more investigative context, a perspective that makes a murder that occurred more than 150 years ago remarkably relevant in today's America.
The more you talked about Lincoln, the self-made man, the less you talked about the contentious, potentially union-dividing slavery issue, the better it turned out for Lincoln.
This is not an in-depth biography of Lincoln, nor of his assassin, John Wilkes Booth. No conjecture about why the Civil War was fought, nor any of the usual minutiae of Lincoln's second inaugural address. Our focus is precisely on 17 days in April of 1865, a time that saw the end of America's brutal Civil War, the first assassination of a U.S. president, the largest manhunt the country had ever seen, and the rebirth of a nation. In its wake, we saw the canonization of a humble, backwoods country lawyer turned president, and the demonization of one of the most celebrated actors of his time. The events were so stunning, and the players so larger than life, that many of the facts surrounding those days have been replaced with the broad strokes of legend. You know those strokes. We all do. Lincoln freed the slaves and won the Civil War. John Wilkes Booth was a madman acting alone. However, there is more to this story than you know. Most people would be more than a little surprised to learn that at the heart of the assassination plot was an intricate conspiracy that nearly decapitated the federal government. It was a conspiracy that sought to destabilize the fragile peace that had been won on the battlefield just weeks before by the Union Army. More shocking are the revelations of just how far the government went in its efforts to capture, convict, and condemn the alleged conspirators with little or no evidence. It's a story that shows how the lines are so often blurred between hero and villain, immortality and infamy, justice and vengeance, and how in that respect nothing has changed today. Welcome to the Ides of April. I'm Alec Baldwin. Episode 1, Northern Aggression. It's difficult to overstate how earth-shattering the events of the evening of April 14, 1865, actually were. Of course, there is nothing comparable to the tragedy of the Civil War. We can, however, draw comparisons to other times of incredible division and strife in our country, especially today. Let's go back to January 2021. Joe Biden has won an incredibly contentious presidential election. Former President Donald Trump then claims election fraud and refuses to concede. Factions of the extreme right attempt to block the certification by storming the Capitol on January 6th. They fail in that attempt. Joe Biden is inaugurated on the 20th of January, and Trump returns to Florida. But to many on the right, the fight was far from over. In an effort to illustrate just how unbelievable the events of April 14th, 1865 really were, consider a contemporary scene and one of obvious fiction. It's a Tuesday in late January 2021. You're in New York City to catch a performance of Hamilton. Without question, the most popular Broadway show in a generation. You have seats about halfway backstage, right? Upon arrival, you're informed that some surprise guests will be in attendance that evening: the newly elected President Biden and First Lady Dr. Jill Biden. Regardless of political affiliation, the fact that a sitting president is in attendance is cause for some excitement. The presidential box is about 12 feet above stage left. You settle into the show, but you can't help but cast an occasional glance up toward the president's balcony. He and the First Lady seem to be enjoying themselves. As the play barrels toward its crescendo, the audience seems to forget that they're sharing the evening with the leader of the free world. Then, just as Aaron Burr fires the fatal shot at Alexander Hamilton, bang! Wait, was that an actual gunshot? It certainly sounded like one that came from the audience instead of the stage. In fact, it sounded like it came from the president's box. Then the screaming starts. And before you can even register what might be going on, you see a man leap from the presidential box onto the stage. The man stands to his full height and raises a bloody dagger above his head. Your first thought, everyone's first thought is, why is Leonardo DiCaprio on stage right now? But even before that thought can fully register, the man on stage, yes, it is DiCaprio, shouts, "Make America Great Again." Then Leo runs off stage, through the dressing rooms, out into the Manhattan streets, where he disappears on the run. And there you are, stunned, along with the rest of the crowd, and soon the rest of the world. You're likely thinking two thoughts amidst the chaos erupting all around you. The first being, holy shit, did Leonardo DiCaprio just assassinate the president? And the second, holy shit, is Leo DiCaprio a MAGA Republican? As outlandish as this scenario may seem, it pales in comparison to the Lincoln assassination in several ways. One is comparing John Wilkes Booth to Leonardo DiCaprio, and it's not in the way you might think. Booth was every bit as popular as Leo in his day, but here's where the comparison falls short. Leo's fame would only be commensurate with Booth's if Leo's older brother happened to be Daniel Day-Lewis, and Leo's father was Laurence Olivier. That's how famous Booth was. Before television, before movies, there was only live theater, and the Booth family were stars of the highest order. Booth's father, Junius Brutus Booth, was considered the Shakespearean actor of his generation. Critical raves for his King Lear are unmatched to this day. And John Wilkes' older brother Edwin was widely considered to simply be the finest stage performer of the period. Edwin was an artist, whereas John Wilkes was a star. As recently as 3 months before the assassination, a consensus was reached among the leading newspapers of the Northeast that John Wilkes Booth was the handsomest man in America. It was the kind of attention that would have mortified and embarrassed Edwin, but John Wilkes loved it. He loved being a celebrity. However, he privately longed for the professional respect and recognition that was heaped upon the other actors in his family. He had another sibling, Junius Jr., who was also a tremendous talent and Shakespearean master. His critical reviews outshone those of John Wilkes, but he wasn't the star that his little brother was. Let's consider the question, who was John Wilkes Booth come the spring of 1865? His actions were ultimately an extension of his belief that he alone had the power to deliver the South from the tyrannical rule of Abraham Lincoln. But how did he get there? How did a kid from Maryland, a northern state, raised in a liberal progressive home full of artists and poets, grow up to become a political tool of the Southern Rebellion? Furthermore, how did Booth become a radicalized, non-military combatant who carried out a stunning terrorist attack? And on what he considered foreign soil? John Wilkes Booth did not kill Lincoln because he was an actor. He killed Lincoln the way he did because he was an actor. His insecurities about his celebrity and comparisons to his father and siblings fueled him. His towering ego dictated more and more of his decisions as the Civil War drew to a close. He deemed that his options for effecting a victory for the South were running out. Booth's subsequent choices would confound his pursuers, ingratiate his disciples, steal the hearts of women, and lead to his ultimate fiery end. Let's begin on a rainy spring day in Virginia. The date is April 9th, 1865, a mere 5 days before the assassination that would send shockwaves throughout the world. April 9th was a memorable day, and for at least half the country, it brought the best news they could hope for. In Appomattox County, Virginia, in the small village with the unusual name of Appomattox Courthouse, General Lee of the Confederate States of America found his army outnumbered, nearly 3-1, and cut off from their retreat by General Grant of the Union Army of the North. It was an act of compassion to not sacrifice his army of nearly 30,000 men. It was also an act of honor that was expected of men of Lee's stature. Grant recognized this and followed suit by allowing the defeated Lee his choice of venue to discuss terms. A trusted aide was dispatched into the village of Appomattox Courthouse in order to find a suitable location for the generals to meet. The aide chose a lovely 2-story brick home with a handsome front staircase, veranda, and most importantly, a parlor on the first floor to formally receive guests. It's interesting to note that 4 years earlier, the first land battle of the Civil War was fought in Manassas, Virginia. This was the Battle of Bull Run, fought on a farm owned by Wilmer McLean, who shortly after moved his family south to escape the horrors of the war that nearly destroyed his home. Wilmer McLean had witnessed the beginning of the war on his own doorstep, and now, almost 4 years later, that war would end in the house he bought to leave the war behind, this 2-story brick home in Appomattox County. McLean is reported to have remarked, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." More of the Ides of April after the break. Lee's surrender ended nearly 4 years of bloody battle that took the lives of over 650,000 people, a number that reflected roughly 2% of the U.S. population at the time. To illustrate, that number would be closer to 7 million Americans lost based on today's population. It was the bloodiest of times. Families ripped apart. Cities destroyed by fire and looting. American cities destroyed by American soldiers. It was undoubtedly the most dire test America has faced before or since the inception of our constitutional experiment. In simple terms, the Civil War was fought between loyalists from the industrial North and secessionists from the agricultural South. The loyalists from the North were committed to the Constitution and willing to fight for its laws. The Southern secessionists favored the fight for states' rights in order to maintain the institution of slavery, the backbone of their economy. The American political climate has always been rife with division, but even juxtaposed against today's polarized environment, it has never been nearly as divided as it was during the Civil War. Extreme loss of life was the reality in the early 1860s, and until April 9th, it was far from certain which side would prevail. But then it happened. Lee surrendered. The nightmare had ended. General Robert E. Lee emerged from a small farmhouse near the battlefield and addressed his assembled troops.
After 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. By the terms of the agreement, officers and men can return to their homes and remain until exchanged. You will take with you the satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed. I earnestly pray that a merciful God will extend to you his blessing and protection. With an unceasing admiration of your constancy and devotion to your country, and a grateful remembrance of your kind and generous consideration for myself, I bid you an affectionate farewell.
Enter the newly re-elected President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had led a fractured nation through unimaginable losses would deftly navigate the political pitfalls that might have consumed a lesser leader. He took those enormous risks that have always been necessary for systemic change. Lincoln was sharply focused on his singular mission, the preservation of the Union. He was determined to ensure the North's victory would be lasting and meaningful, and not the Pyrrhic kind so many had prophesied. The re-elected president made a simple and beautiful gesture to his conquered enemy, a gesture he hoped would set a new course in the tumultuous life of a young nation. He announced that everyone should just go home. He made it clear that we were all Americans again, that there were no longer enemies within the borders of the United States. He implored both sides to lay down their weapons and return to the lives that they had before years of war intervened. All prisoners of war were to be immediately and unconditionally released. Reconstruction in the southern states was to begin at once. The days that followed saw a flurry of activity both in Washington and around the country as word spread that the war was over and everyone was to return to their lives. Union soldiers flocked back to Washington, and waves of Confederate troops were making the long walk to train stations, riverboats, dockyards, any way they could to find a way home. Meanwhile, agents of the Union Army were racing to the front lines of various encampments, which were great distances from telegraph offices and still hadn't been made aware of the news that the war was over. Most notably, Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston had yet to surrender to Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. News of the ongoing fight reached Washington before news of the surrender reached Confederate General Johnston. This news, that some factions of the Confederacy were still fighting, was highly influential to one man who clung to the belief that he still had the power to make a difference. On the evening of April 11, 1865, 2 days after the South's unconditional surrender, and 3 days before the assassination, President Lincoln delivered a speech from a second-story balcony to a crowd gathered on the White House lawn. It was his first public address since the war had ended and his first official remarks concerning Reconstruction. He was short-handed that evening. His former rivalry for the presidency, who had become a trusted friend and advisor, Secretary of State William Seward, had been bedridden for several days, recovering from a carriage accident that left him immobile. Seward House Museum Director Maria Coleman.
It's even touch and go for a little bit at the beginning. He has bruises on his face, swelling, a concussion. His right shoulder is dislocated. His right arm is broken. His jaw is fractured. He can barely speak more than a whisper. And Lincoln is just, a width away from him, and they're whispering back and forth to one another.
His absence had been acutely felt by Lincoln. Seward was his right hand and kept him honest. Seward challenged him, argued with him over policy, consoled him during a long and grueling Civil War, and played a major role in Lincoln's re-election just 5 months previous. Lincoln visited him often as he recuperated for advice, speech writing, and for friendship.
He got lucky with Seward for sure.
Lincoln historian Howard Holzer.
Not only because he was very competent, Lincoln didn't always listen to him, but he had great ideas, but because he became an intimate friend of Lincoln's. Seward became Lincoln's best friend. He spent hours at his home near Lafayette Park, breathing all that secondhand cigar smoke, watching as Seward drank brandy in the evening, and he was his confidant. They were very, very close, and I think Lincoln needed a peer.
And despite the fact that Seward felt the speech Lincoln would give this particular evening was too soon, he still signed off on it as a matter of policy and offered his opinion on a few changes to Lincoln's original text. Before Lincoln stepped onto the balcony to deliver his speech, there had been a small gathering of about a dozen staff and family members. It was intended to be a subdued celebration to mark the end of the war. The president, however, was quick to remind anyone showing too much joy that the cost of the victory simply would not allow for elation nor glee. It had been 4 years of Americans killing Americans, and Lincoln secretly feared that the country might never recover. Tonight's speech would be the first step toward that seemingly impossible goal. As Lincoln began his remarks, at least one member of his cabinet was entirely unhappy with the situation at hand. The president, he believed, would be an easy target for anyone in the crowd who happened to have a rifle and wanted to take a shot at him. And the city was overflowing with soldiers returning home, who was to say there weren't Confederate spies, still loyal to the cause, lurking about, waiting for the right moment to strike. The man who was so worried about the president's safety was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. If William Seward was the poised and thoughtful diplomat, Edwin Stanton was the hammer of the gods. A man of war, a man of strategy and constancy, of honor and loyalty. There was also a time that Stanton, like Seward, hated Abraham Lincoln. But by this point, Stanton, again like Seward, had grown to respect Lincoln as a man, to love him as a friend, and to dutifully serve at his side.
Stanton turns out to be a brilliant organizer. I mean, a totally abrasive personality. He would not have lasted long in the feel-good movement of today. He was not nice to his employees, to visitors, to politicians. And he was critical of Lincoln. He didn't like Lincoln's sense of humor. He didn't like Lincoln's propensity for reading joke books at cabinet meetings. And one day he said to Stanton, "You don't seem to understand that if I didn't laugh, I would cry all the time." But Lincoln and he agreed on generalship, on strategy, on tactics. And Stanton was just a brilliant enough organizer that he found his way into Lincoln's heart, and vice versa.
Stanton also agreed that the content of Lincoln's speech, which would be reprinted in every newspaper across the country within a few days, went too far, and expected too much from an enemy so recently vanquished. But the president had made up his mind. In the gathered crowd on the lawn below the balcony were a few hundred people who had heard that President Lincoln would be delivering remarks concerning Reconstruction and the status of enemy combatants. These remarks were to be of particular interest to 4 men in the crowd who would end up playing a major role in the events of the following 2 weeks. There was 30-year-old George Atzerodt, a hard-drinking German immigrant and failed businessman. Standing next to him was Lewis Powell, a 21-year-old Confederate Civil War veteran wounded at Gettysburg and former member of the Confederate Secret Service. Close by was Davy Herold, 23 years old, a graduate of Charlotte Hall Military Academy and a pharmacist's assistant. We'll get to the 4th man in a moment, but we should mention briefly how the first 3 men were connected. They were all, in one way or another, friends with a man named John Surratt. Surratt also served in the Confederate Secret Service, but more importantly, his mother, Mary Surratt, owned a boarding house in Washington City. It would not officially become the District of Columbia until 1871. It was at this boarding house where John Surratt was able to meet all types of characters who were loyal to the Southern cause. It was Surratt who introduced the 3 men to the other man gathered that night among the crowd on the White House lawn, John Wilkes Booth. All dressed in black, Booth had an impressive mane of dark hair and a groomed and brilliant mustache. Today, Booth would most likely be described as a cult leader with followers who were true disciples and obeyed his every command. Many would eventually die as a result of their loyalty to Booth. But on this night, Booth cared little for Surratt's company. He was still reeling from the news of Lee's surrender, news he refused to accept. The only thing keeping Booth's hopes alive was the knowledge that General Johnston was still in the fight, and Booth felt the need to help in any way he could. The crowd listened intently as President Lincoln began his remarks.
We all agree that the seceded states, so-called, are out of their proper relation with the Union, and that the sole object of government, civil and military, in regard to those states, is to again get them into that proper practical relation. I believe it is not only possible, but in fact easier to do this without deciding, or even considering whether these states have ever been out of the Union, than with it. Finding themselves safely at home, it would be utterly immaterial whether they had ever been abroad. Let us all join in doing the acts necessary to restoring the proper practical relations between these states and the Union. It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man, nor giving the benefit of public schools equally to black and white, and empowering the legislature to confer the elective franchise upon the colored man. In the present situation, as the phrase goes, it may be my duty to make some new announcement to the people of the South. I am considering, and shall not fail to act when satisfied, that action will be proper.
As Lincoln finished and the applause died down, Davy Harold, one of Booth's companions, was confused. As he often did, Davy looked to Booth for help, understanding what the president meant with all his educated language. Booth, though disgusted and loath to repeat such foul words, knew how important it was for his followers to understand exactly what kind of monster he believed Lincoln was. Booth explained to Davy, George, and Lewis that Lincoln was ordering no punishment to anyone who fought for the South, and that he also intended through Reconstruction to permit freed slaves to attend public schools and one day to be able to vote in the country's elections.
Booth knows that it's a revolutionary act. Booth knows that it's a radical statement because two sources say that he turned to his co-conspirator and said that means Negro equality, and he doesn't use the word Negro.
It was no secret to Booth what Lincoln was really saying in his landmark address. Lincoln intended to allow freed slaves to become full citizens of the United States, bestowed with all the rights guaranteed therein. For an angry, virulent racist like John Wilkes Booth, that simply was not acceptable. In his seething anger, Booth pointed up at the president and declared that it would be the last speech Lincoln would ever make. He turned out to be right. On the next episode, we learn how John Wilkes Booth became a radicalized tool of the Confederacy.
It's not only obviously an element of insanity, but it's also motivated by white supremacy to the highest degree. And he's going to be a hero to the Old South and to the Old Order.
His numerous failed attempts at aiding the war effort.
They weren't murderers. They were violent. They were a mob, but they were kidnappers, I guess, in the extreme.
And how he feared that for all his missed opportunities, he could make up for it with one fatal blow.
It's always theatrical, and Booth is very theatrical. The play's the thing, right?
That's next time on The Ides of April. The Ides of April was created, produced, and written by Brandon Morgan. Our executive producers are Brandon Morgan and Matt Del Piano. Zach McNeese is our story editor, sound designer, and mixer. I'm Alec Baldwin. Thanks for listening.